April 7th, 2024, 8:15 a.m. The morning sun stretched long golden fingers across the quiet streets of Charlotte, as if trying to erase the shadows lurking in its corners. But no amount of light could touch what was brewing just beyond the heavy oak doors of Harmony Grace Church. Inside, the sanctuary hummed with life, yet a fragile stillness lingered in the air. Stained glass windows, masterpieces of craftsmanship, cast a kaleidoscope of colours onto polished wooden pews. The faint aroma of lilies mixed with the earthy scent of old hymnals. It was a scene painted with serenity, but beneath the surface, cracks threatened to reveal themselves. At the pulpit, Pastor Nathaniel gripped the edges of the polished wood. His hands, so steady in their gesture of faith, now trembled imperceptibly. He scanned the room as he prepared his sermon, his gaze lingering on the congregation like a shepherd watching over his flock. But even a shepherd knows when a wolf waits at the edge of the forest. Outside, Aaron Williams stood in the church's shadow. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, the weight in his pocket cold and familiar. His eyes, shadowed with anguish, darted to the stained glass windows where light refracted into colours too beautiful for the storm raging inside him. The choir began softly. Their hymn was soothing, a melody meant to cradle the weary. But for Aaron, each note felt like a needle pressing against a wound he had tried to forget. Inside, Nathaniel cleared his throat, his voice low and resonant. Faith is tested not when the path is clear, but when the shadows grow long. His words, rehearsed and delivered with conviction, echoed through the sanctuary, but the echo felt hollow. He glanced at the door again, the briefest flicker of unease flashing across his face. The sanctuary itself seemed to hold its breath. A child whispered to their mother, who hushed them gently. A faint breeze carried the scent of lilies from the altar. Every detail felt ordinary, yet heavy with expectation, as if the room itself knew it was on the precipice of something it could not stop. Aaron took one step closer to the doors, his boots scuffing the concrete. The hymn drifted to him again, muffled through thick wood, a mocking promise of peace. Inside, Nathaniel shifted his weight. His knuckles whitened against the pulpit as he paused mid-sentence, his heart racing beneath his pristine robe. And outside, the shadow moved closer, step by step, breath by breath. What happens when the storm meets the sanctuary? And when the doors open, will it be faith or fury that walks inside? 8:28 a.m. The sun still shone brightly, but Harmony Grace Church stood in its shadow. 8:31 a.m. Nathaniel Cross had spent years perfecting the art of composure, but this morning, cracks were beginning to show. Standing at the pulpit, scanning a room full of familiar faces, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone's absence was far more telling than their presence. His voice carried over the congregation, steady and practiced. In times of trial, it is not our strength that carries us, but our faith. And faith. His words faltered for a moment, a nearly imperceptible hesitation that might have gone unnoticed to most, but not to Sophia. From her seat, 3 rows back, Sophia Cross tilted her head ever so slightly. Her dark eyes lingered on her husband's hands gripping the pulpit, the knuckles pale against the polished wood. She had seen this posture before, Nathaniel's silent tell when the weight of the world pressed too heavily on his shoulders. Sophia's mind wandered. Lately, she had felt the distance between them widening, like the shoreline retreating from the ocean. There was something unsaid, something Nathaniel wasn't telling her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it, gnawing at the edges of their life together. Across the room, Malcolm Porter sat in the last pew, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on Nathaniel. Malcolm had always been a skeptic, the first to question decisions and the last to offer his approval. Today was no different. There was a faint smirk on his face, as if he were daring Nathaniel to stumble. And yet, there was no outward rebellion in the sanctuary. The choir's soft hymn floated through the room. The congregation sat quietly, nodding along to Nathaniel's sermon. On the surface, everything appeared peaceful, but Sophia knew better. She could sense the tension hanging like smoke, and it seemed she wasn't the only one. 8:35 a.m. outside, Aaron Williams leaned against the stone wall of the church, his chest tight with the weight of memories. He had walked this same path years ago, drawn to Harmony Grace not by faith, but by the man who preached it. Nathaniel had seen something in him that no one else had, a flicker of hope beneath the anger and despair. For Aaron, Nathaniel wasn't just a pastor. He was salvation. But salvation had its cost. Aaron clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. The betrayal burned in his mind. The whispered promises, the stolen moments, all of it had felt so real. Until it wasn't. Flashes of their last conversation played in his head, sharp and vivid as lightning. Nathaniel's voice, calm but resolute, had carried a weight that Aaron hadn't understood at the time. "We can't keep this going," Nathaniel had said, his words like a blade cutting through the air. "It's not right. It's not what God wants." Aaron had begged him to reconsider, pleaded with him to see reason. But Nathaniel had only shaken his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that Aaron couldn't forgive. "You have to let me go." The memory of that moment sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through him. He looked up at the stained glass windows, the fractured lights spilling onto the ground like shards of broken promises. His hand brushed against the cold metal in his pocket, a grim reminder of the choice he had made. Inside, Nathaniel's sermon continued, but his words felt hollow even to himself. He couldn't stop his eyes from darting toward the doors, couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was coming. He tried to focus, to anchor himself in the scripture he had recited 100 times before. But his voice wavered just enough to draw a few curious glances from the congregation. Sophia caught the moment immediately. Her heart tightened as she studied him. Her husband, who always seemed larger than life, now looked small and uncertain. She couldn't help but wonder, what was he hiding? In the back of the room, Malcolm leaned forward slightly, a flicker of interest crossing his face. Mrs. Porter, seated beside him, whispered something under her breath, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked at Nathaniel. The congregation was still, but there was a quiet undercurrent of tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. Nathaniel gripped the pulpit tighter, his voice steadying as he finished the verse. "And in the darkest of times, we must find the strength to face what comes." 8:40 a.m. Aaron took another step toward the doors, his heart pounding as the weight of his decision settled over him. The man inside that church wasn't just a pastor. He was the man who had built Aaron up and then torn him down. The man who had promised him something sacred, only to walk away. Aaron's hand tightened around the object in his pocket. His breaths came shallow and quick, but his steps were deliberate. This wasn't just about Nathaniel. This was about truth, about justice, about facing the lies that had destroyed everything. As he reached for the door handle, one thought burned in his mind. When everything you believed in crumbles, what do you hold on to? And when love turns to betrayal, is forgiveness even possible? 8:42 a.m. Nathaniel's voice faltered for the second time that morning. The sanctuary was silent, save for the soft hum of the microphone, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that warned something was coming. He cleared his throat, his gaze drifting once again to the double doors at the back of the room. His sermon, one he had rehearsed with careful precision, now felt foreign on his tongue. Words meant to inspire faith seemed to hang heavy in the air, weighed down by a secret he could no longer contain. Sophia noticed it immediately, the slight crack in his usually unshakable voice. From her seat, she watched as Nathaniel's eyes darted to the door and back again, his fingers tightening around the edges of the pulpit. In the choir loft, the hymn began to rise, soft and steady. The lyrics spoke of grace and redemption, a call to surrender burdens to a higher power. But today, those words seemed to mock Nathaniel more than comforting. What happens when the shepherd becomes the lamb, vulnerable and exposed? Nathaniel's chest tightened with the weight of the question, one he dared not answer. Outside, Aaron Williams stood frozen, his hand trembling just above the handle of the church doors. The hymns seeped through the cracks, muffled but persistent. He hated how they sounded beautiful, how they reminded him of days when the world didn't feel so broken. Days when Nathaniel's voice had been his sanctuary, his anchor in the storm. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as he clenched his jaw. He thought of all the times Nathaniel had looked him in the eye and told him he was worth saving. Those words had felt real, but they were just lies. Lies wrapped in scripture and bound by shame. He pulled his hand back from the door and stared at the weapon tucked in his pocket. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Could he go through with this? Could he really confront the man who had given him hope only to shatter it? Aaron's hand brushed over the cold steel again. The answer was there, in the weight of it. Forgiveness had no place here, not today. Nathaniel's sermon wavered as the crackling microphone filled the pauses between his words. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, sensing something unspoken in the air. Malcolm Porter leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed. "The good pastor's off his game today," he muttered to Mrs. Porter, who responded with a curt nod. Nathaniel's gaze flicked toward the door once more. He tried to steady his breathing, to focus on the familiar faces before him. Sophia, ever observant, tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowed as she tracked her husband's movements. The crackling microphone broke again, louder this time, making Nathaniel flinch. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the courage to confront it. His voice was firm, but the meaning behind the words twisted in his mind. And yet, as the words left his mouth, the fear inside him only grew. Fear of what lay beyond the doors, and fear of what would happen when they opened. 8:49 a.m. Aaron's steps were slow, deliberate, as he approached the doors for the final time. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, loud and relentless, drowning out the sound of the hymn. His mind raced with memories of Nathaniel, the quiet moments they'd shared, the promises whispered in the dark, and then the betrayal. He gritted his teeth as the anger surged again, hotter and sharper than before. The lies, the rejection, the hollow apologies, they all led to this moment. Aaron reached for the door handle, his fingers curling around it tightly. There was no turning back now. The weight in his pocket felt heavier than ever, but it also felt right. As he pushed the door open, the light from the sanctuary spilled out onto the steps, bathing him in its glow. For a fleeting second, he hesitated. Was there still a chance to stop? To forgive? Or had the storm already claimed its path? 8:52 a.m. The wooden doors of Harmony Grace Church creaked open, their echo cascading through the sanctuary like a ripple in a still pond. Every head turned toward the source of the sound, the sacred stillness of the room shattered by the weight of unspoken tension. Aaron stepped inside, his presence heavy with the kind of quiet that demanded attention. He paused in the aisle, letting the doors swing shut behind him, their thud resonating in the hushed room. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the walls with fractured colors that seemed at odds with the storm brewing within. Nathaniel froze mid-sentence, his hand gripping the edge of the pulpit so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart raced as he locked eyes with Aaron, the man he had thought, prayed, would never come back. Aaron's face was a mask of calm, but his clenched fists betrayed the tempest beneath. The weight of years of pain and betrayal pressed against his chest, but his steps were steady as he advanced down the aisle, each one louder than the last. 8:53 a.m. The congregation's whispers started like a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. Mrs. Porter leaned toward Malcolm, her voice trembling. "Who is that man? Do you think he's—" Malcolm shook his head, his eyes never leaving Aaron. "Whoever he is, he doesn't look like he's here for salvation." Sophia's stomach churned as she followed Nathaniel's gaze. She had seen that look on her husband's face before, fear, raw and unfiltered. Her pulse quickened as she shifted in her seat, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Aaron stopped halfway down the aisle, his hand brushing the pocket of his jacket. The sanctuary seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as memories clawed their way to the surface. He saw Nathaniel standing at the pulpit, not as the confident preacher the world revered, but as the man who had held him close and whispered promises that turned to ash. Nathaniel cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he forced himself to speak. "Welcome, brother. The house of God is open to all." But the words felt hollow, and he could see in Aaron's eyes that they held no power here. 8:54 a.m. The moment hung suspended, the air thick with anticipation, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Aaron reached into his pocket, and for a fleeting moment Nathaniel thought, hoped, it was something else. A letter, perhaps, a token of peace. But when the glint of metal caught the light, the hope died as quickly as it had sparked. A gasp rippled through the congregation as Aaron pulled out the gun. The sound of the safety clicking off echoed like thunder in the silence. "Did you think I'd stay silent forever?" Aaron's voice cut through the room, low and steady, but charged with years of suppressed rage. "Did you think I wouldn't find you, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel's knees buckled, but he held his ground, his voice faltering as he spoke. "Aaron, please, this isn't the way." But Aaron shook his head, his grip tightening on the weapon. "It's the only way." 8:55 a.m., and then it happened. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a crack that seemed to split the air itself. Nathaniel staggered back, his hand clutching his chest as a dark stain spread across his shirt. The congregation erupted into chaos. Screams, cries for help, and the clatter of overturned pews filled the sanctuary. Sophia was the first to move, rushing to Nathaniel's side as he collapsed to the floor. Her hands pressed against the wound, her voice breaking as she shouted for someone to call 911. Aaron stood frozen, the gun trembling in his hand. His eyes darted between Nathaniel and the panicked faces of the congregation, the gravity of what he had done sinking in. The weight of years of anger and betrayal lifted in an instant, only to be replaced by something far heavier, regret. And as Nathaniel lay bleeding on the cold stone floor, Aaron's voice broke through the chaos, a single question lingering in the air like smoke. Was it worth it? 8:56 a.m. The sanctuary of Harmony Grace Church was no longer a haven of peace. The stillness had been shattered by a single act of violence, leaving in its wake a cacophony of screams, chaos, and disbelief. Sophia fell to her knees beside Nathaniel, her hands trembling as they pressed against the wound on his chest. Blood seeped between her fingers, a stark crimson against the pale fabric of his shirt. "Someone call 911, she cried, her voice breaking under the weight of panic. Her eyes darted to Nathaniel's face, his breath shallow and labored. The congregation erupted into motion, some rushing toward the doors, others frozen in place, their faces pale with shock. Malcolm, usually steady as a rock, fumbled with his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. The altar, once a symbol of redemption, was now a harrowing scene of desperation. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of lilies from the Easter arrangements. 8:57 a.m. Aaron stood motionless in the center aisle, the gun dangling from his hand. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a crushing tide. He stared at Nathaniel on the floor, the man who had once been his salvation, now bleeding because of him. Regret washed over him in waves, its cold grip tightening around his chest. The voices around him blurred into a dull roar, but one thought rang clear in his mind. What have I done? Mrs. Porter clung to Malcolm's arm, her frail frame shaking. This isn't real, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. This can't be real. Sophia's voice pierced through the noise as she yelled again, Hurry! He's losing too much blood. Her hands pressed harder, her tears falling onto Nathaniel's face. Nathaniel opened his eyes briefly, his gaze meeting Sophia's. He tried to speak, but only a faint, broken whisper escaped his lips. I'm sorry, he murmured, the words barely audible but heavy with meaning. 8:58 a.m. The wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the pandemonium like a razor-sharp blade. Aaron's gaze shifted toward the sound, his heart pounding as reality began to set in. He looked around, his eyes landing on the faces of the people he had just terrified, the people who had once trusted Nathaniel, just as he had. Sophia glanced up at Aaron, her expression a mixture of rage and pleading. What are you standing there for? Help me, she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. But Aaron didn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as though any step forward would sink him deeper into the abyss he had created. 8:59 a.m. The doors burst open and uniformed officers poured into the church, their presence commanding and urgent. Drop the weapon, one of them shouted, their guns trained on Aaron. For a moment, Aaron didn't register the command. The gun felt like an extension of his hand, a symbol of everything he had carried for years, anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Slowly, he raised his arms, the weapon slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the stone floor. The sound echoed through the sanctuary, final and unforgiving. As the officers moved in, one knelt beside Nathaniel while another guided Sophia away. We've got him, the medic assured her, but she didn't release Nathaniel's hand until they pried her fingers loose. 9 a.m. Aaron was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, as the weight of his actions bore down on him. The whispers of the congregation followed him like shadows, each one a reminder of what he had done. Sophia stood frozen, her hands stained with blood, as she watched the medics lift Nathaniel onto a stretcher. The world around her felt distant and surreal, as though she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Nathaniel's stretcher passed by Aaron as the officers guided him toward the door. Their eyes met briefly, a moment heavy with unspoken words. Nathaniel's lips moved, forming a single word before he was wheeled out. Why? Aaron had no answer. And as the church emptied, leaving only the overturned pews and the faint echo of sirens, one question lingered in the air, haunting everyone who remained. Was forgiveness possible after this? 9:02 a.m. Harmony Grace Church was quiet now, not peaceful, but the eerie silence of a storm's aftermath. The once vivid cries of the congregation had dulled to whispers, broken only by the clipped voices of medics and officers. Nathaniel lay on the stretcher, his breathing shallow, his shirt soaked through with blood. The paramedics moved swiftly, their faces set with practiced calm, but their movements betrayed urgency. Sophia hovered nearby, her hands still trembling, the blood on her palms a stark reminder of her helplessness. "Keep pressure here," one medic directed a colleague as they wheeled Nathaniel toward the doors. For a brief moment, Nathaniel's eyes fluttered open, catching Sophia's gaze. His lips moved faintly, but no sound emerged, just a faint, desperate expression that seemed to ask, "Will I survive this?" Across the sanctuary, Aaron stood with his hands cuffed behind his back. The officers flanking him exchanged terse words, their movements efficient, their expressions unreadable. Aaron's head hung low, his eyes fixed on the floor as though afraid to face what he had done. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each one louder than the last. The weight of the handcuffs pressed into his wrists, but the real burden sat heavier on his heart. As he was led toward the doors, the murmurs of the congregation rose again, their words sharp and cutting. "How could he do this?" one voice hissed. "Was it jealousy? Hatred?" whispered another. Aaron stopped briefly at the threshold, his gaze lifting to the stained glass windows overhead. They had survived the chaos, their colors still vibrant, casting fragments of light onto the shattered lives below. The irony wasn't lost on him. 9:05 a.m. The medics loaded Nathaniel into the ambulance, its flashing lights casting rhythmic shadows against the church's facade. Sophia followed closely, her heels clicking against the pavement, her breaths short and uneven. "Will he make it?" she asked, her voice strained as she reached the medic holding the stretcher. "We'll do everything we can," he replied, his tone steady but non-committal. The words hung in the air, neither comforting nor dismissive. As the ambulance doors closed, Sophia stood frozen, watching the vehicle pull away. Her hands, still stained, clenched into fists at her sides. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why had Nathaniel hidden so much? Why hadn't she seen this coming? Why now? Back inside the church, the congregation remained divided. Malcolm paced near the altar, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Porter sat quietly in a pew, her hands clasped tightly around her rosary, her whispered prayers audible in the uneasy silence. "We trusted him," Malcolm muttered, his voice rising. "Both of them, Nathaniel and Aaron, and look where it got us." Mrs. Porter glanced up, her usually gentle expression hardening. "And what good will blame do now, Malcolm? Pray for them, both of them." 9:10 a.m. Aaron stood outside the church, surrounded by officers and flashing lights. The murmurs of the crowd gathered beyond the police line grew louder, their curiosity morphing into judgment with every passing second. "Do you regret it?" an officer asked as he opened the door to the squad car. The question was simple, almost casual, but it pierced Aaron like a dagger. He hesitated, his voice low as he finally replied, "Every second." As the door closed behind him, the crowd's murmurs turned to shouts, accusations, speculation, words he couldn't block out no matter how hard he tried. And as the squad car pulled away, leaving the shattered sanctuary behind, one question echoed louder than any other. In the face of unimaginable betrayal and loss, who bears the greater burden? The sinner or the betrayed? What does forgiveness look like when the wounds are still bleeding? In the summer of 1998, the sun blazed over the cracked asphalt of Evergreen Baptist's parking lot, the heat shimmering like a mirage. A teenage Nathaniel, tall and wiry, dribbled a worn basketball with single-minded determination. His sneakers squeaked against the court, his focus unshakable. This was his sanctuary then, a place where he could escape the chaos of a home splintered by silence. His mother prayed fervently, his father worked tirelessly, and Nathaniel ran endlessly, always chasing something that felt just out of reach. On this particular day, a voice broke through the steady rhythm of the bouncing ball. "Nice shot," said Pastor Eldridge, stepping onto the court in polished loafers that seemed misplaced against the rough terrain. Nathaniel glanced up, startled. The pastor wasn't a regular on the court, but his presence carried a quiet authority that made the boy pause. "You ever think about channeling that focus into something greater?" Eldridge asked, holding the ball Nathaniel had let slip from his hands. Over the months that followed, Pastor Eldridge became a fixture in Nathaniel's life. Not a mentor, not yet a confidant, but a steady hand guiding him through the turbulence of adolescence. In the church office, surrounded by shelves of theology books and the faint scent of pine cleaner, Eldridge taught Nathaniel more than scripture. He taught him how to listen, truly listen, and to hold space for the brokenness in others. But even as Nathaniel absorbed these lessons, cracks began to form in his own foundation. There were questions he couldn't ask, doubts he couldn't voice. What did grace mean for someone who couldn't find peace within himself? Could he lead others when he felt so lost? And what if the truth about who he was, who he loved, meant he wasn't worthy of this calling at all? By 2003, Nathaniel stood at the pulpit for the first time. The congregation was small, intimate, and filled with faces he had known since childhood. His sermon was simple. We are all vessels of light, even when we feel surrounded by darkness. But even as the words flowed from his lips, his chest tightened. Was this conviction he felt, or fear? He avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the stained glass windows that cast fragments of color onto the pews. He thought about the basketball court, the sanctuary he'd lost when he traded sneakers for sermons. The windows, with their intricate depictions of faith and salvation, became his refuge. Yet as the years passed, they began to feel more like mirrors, reflecting not just the beauty of grace, but the fractures he tried so desperately to conceal. In the winter of 2012, Nathaniel knelt before the altar, the church empty but for him and the shadows. Snow fell quietly outside, muffling the world beyond those heavy oak doors. This was the moment he knew that no prayer could erase the parts of himself he'd buried deep. He gripped the edge of the altar, his knuckles white, his whispered plea barely audible. "Am I enough?" The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't that God didn't answer. It was that Nathaniel feared the answer more than the silence. And now, lying on a stretcher outside Harmony Grace Church, the weight of those unanswered questions bore down on him like never before. His breaths were shallow, his vision blurred, but one thought pulsed through his mind with relentless clarity. Did my cracks doom me, or were they the light breaking through? Can a man built on fragile foundations truly hold others steady? Or are we all just a mosaic of broken pieces, hoping the light finds its way through? The first time Nathaniel's words gave Aaron hope, it was late spring, the air filled with the crisp promise of renewal. They had met at a small community centre in Charleston, a faded brick building that smelled faintly of mildew and overused coffee makers. Nathaniel had been volunteering, a fresh seminary graduate, exuding a confidence that Aaron hadn't seen in himself for years. Aaron had been sitting in the back row, shoulders hunched, his hands fidgeting with a frayed edge of his hoodie. He wasn't there for religion, not really. He was there because he'd run out of places to be. But something in Nathaniel's sermon, a story about finding light in the darkest places, made him look up. Nathaniel had caught his eye that day, offering a small, knowing smile. "You're not broken," Nathaniel said after the service when he approached Aaron. "You're just a work in progress, and that's okay." For the first time in years, Aaron didn't feel invisible. Years later, the memory of that moment haunted him, but not for the reasons he expected. Sitting in the interrogation room after the shooting, Aaron stared at the cold steel table, his reflection staring back at him, a man he barely recognized. How had he gone from being a scared young man yearning for hope to someone who could pull the trigger in a room filled with people? He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to block out the images that replayed over and over. Nathaniel's face, the gasp of the congregation, the sound of his own breath, ragged and uneven. The officers asked their questions, their words a dull hum in the background. He didn't answer. How could he? How could he explain the betrayal he felt when he discovered Nathaniel had kept secrets, secrets that shattered the fragile trust he had clung to for so long? The betrayal wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unraveling. It started 6 months ago when Aaron stumbled upon a text message meant for Nathaniel, a message that hinted at something more than friendship with someone else in the congregation. At first, Aaron dismissed it. Nathaniel had been his anchor, his compass. But the doubts crept in, growing louder with every unanswered question. Why did Nathaniel pull away when Aaron needed him most? Why did his words of encouragement feel hollow in the light of unspoken truths? One night, fueled by suspicion and an ache he couldn't name, Aaron confronted Nathaniel in the dim light of the church office. "Do you love him?" Aaron's voice had cracked under the weight of the question. Nathaniel's silence was all the confirmation Aaron needed. Sitting on a bench outside the church that night, Aaron had felt a storm building within him. A storm that carried the weight of every rejection, every unanswered prayer, every time someone told him he wasn't enough. He wanted to walk away, to leave the church and Nathaniel behind, but the weight of their shared history held him there. Nathaniel had been his savior once, his guiding light. How could he reconcile the man who had given him hope with the one who had betrayed it? The gun, he told himself, wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about ending Nathaniel's life. It was about making him see the damage he had caused, forcing him to confront the consequences of his choices. But now, sitting in that interrogation room, the weight of the weapon long gone from his hands, Aaron felt the crushing realization of what he had done. Had he become the very thing Nathaniel had once saved him from? The door to the room opened, and an officer entered, placing a small folded note on the table. "It's from Nathaniel," the officer said before leaving. Aaron stared at the note for what felt like hours before reaching for it. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, but the words inside were simple. "You are still a work in progress. I forgive you." As tears blurred his vision, Aaron questioned the meaning of forgiveness. Could he forgive himself? Could he ever make amends for what he had done? Can redemption be found in the wake of destruction, or is it a hollow promise for those who've crossed an unforgivable line? And more importantly, does forgiveness from others mean anything if you can't forgive yourself? The sanctuary of Harmony Grace Church, once a beacon of peace and unity, now stood in shattered silence. The air was heavy with the scent of candles that no longer flickered and the faint metallic tang of blood that stained the altar. Sophia Cheng stood alone in the vast emptiness, her figure dwarfed by the wreckage of overturned pews and shards of stained glass that glinted in the dim morning light. The whispers of the congregation, the screams of that fateful day, still echoed in her ears. She knelt beside the altar, her fingers trembling as they brushed against a jagged piece of colored glass. It was a fragment from the window that had once depicted the parable of the lost sheep, now reduced to nothing more than a metaphor for their fractured community. Sophia inhaled deeply, her breath shaky. She had spent years as the silent observer, the one who saw what others overlooked. Nathaniel's hesitation during sermons, Aaron's lingering glances, the tension that had been building long before it erupted. She had seen it all, but said nothing. Now silence was no longer an option. Her grief was a complex tapestry, interwoven with anger and disbelief. How could Nathaniel, the man she trusted implicitly, harbor secrets that would tear their sanctuary apart? How could Aaron, a man she had come to know as vulnerable and desperate for connection, allow his pain to consume him so completely? She clenched the piece of glass in her hand, its sharp edge biting into her palm. The sting grounded her, forcing her to confront the reality she had tried to ignore. Nathaniel's betrayal wasn't hers to fix, but the aftermath, the broken trust, the fractured community, was now her burden to bear. Days after the shooting, Sophia stood before the congregation, her heart pounding as she faced their fragmented faces. Some wore expressions of blame, others of despair, but all of them looked to her for answers. "I won't pretend to have all the answers," she began, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "But what I do know is this. We are more than the choices of one man. We are more than the pain inflicted by another. We are a community, and if we want to survive, we have to find a way to come back together." Her words hung in the air, met with silence. She didn't expect applause or even nods of agreement. Healing wasn't instantaneous. It was a process, one that began with small, deliberate steps. In the quiet moments, when the weight of leadership bore down on her, Sophia allowed herself the space to grieve. She sat alone in her modest apartment, staring at the same sermons Nathaniel had once prepared with so much conviction, searching for a glimmer of the man she thought she knew. The doubts crept in like uninvited guests. Was she strong enough to guide them? Was she worthy of the role that fate had thrust upon her? Sophia had spent her life avoiding the spotlight, content to play the supporting role. Now she was center stage, and the stakes had never been higher. One Sunday morning, she stood at the pulpit, her fingers trailing over its worn edges. The sanctuary was quieter now, the numbers fewer, but those who remained looked to her with cautious hope. She held up the same piece of broken stained glass she had clutched on the day of the shooting, its jagged edges glinting in the light streaming through the half-repaired windows. "This," she said, holding it up for all to see, "is a reminder of what we've lost, but it's also a reminder of what we can rebuild. Each of you, in your own way, is a piece of this broken window. Alone we may feel jagged, incomplete, but together we can create something beautiful again." A murmur rippled through the room, faint but palpable. It was a start. Sophia knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The congregation was still divided, their wounds still raw. But as she walked through the sanctuary that afternoon, her footsteps echoing in the silence, she felt a spark of resolve. Would she be able to unite them, to rebuild what had been so violently torn apart? Or would the fractures prove too deep, too permanent? And if she failed, could she ever forgive herself for not being enough? Harmony Grace Church was no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield of words, divided hearts and wounded souls. The air in the community hall crackled with tension, the weight of unresolved questions suffocating the room. It was Thursday, 7 p.m., a gathering called to address the aftermath of the unthinkable. Rows of folding chairs, hastily arranged in concentric circles, bore the weight of a congregation fractured by scandal and violence. Malcolm, his voice gravelly with years of quiet leadership, stood first. "Nathaniel has given more to this church than most of us can comprehend. Are we going to let one mistake, however grave, erase all that he's built here?" His words carried the steadiness of a man clinging to hope, but his eyes betrayed his own doubts. A murmured response rippled through the room, half agreement, half rejection. Mrs. Porter, her wiry frame rigid with indignation, stood next. Her words cut like glass. "Forgiveness? How can we forgive what hasn't been fully confessed? Secrets have no place here, and neither do men who keep them." Across the room, younger voices began to rise, ones that spoke of grace and second chances. A timid young woman, no older than 20, clutched her Bible to her chest as she whispered, "Isn't the point of our faith redemption? Nathaniel is human. Don't we all fall short?" But her words were swallowed by louder protests from the older generation, many of whom had held Nathaniel as a moral compass, now feeling betrayed by his hidden truths. The debate spiraled into chaos. Accusations flew, trust was questioned, and alliances were drawn. Each person seemed to believe their perspective held the answer, yet no one dared speak the question that loomed largest in their hearts. Could the congregation survive this? In the corner, Sophia observed silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had called the meeting, hoping to foster dialogue, but it was clear she had underestimated the depth of the wounds. Every voice raised against Nathaniel felt like a dagger twisting in her chest. Every voice defending him was a weight pressing down on her shoulders, demanding an impossible balance between justice and mercy. Malcolm's voice rose above the din, sharp and commanding. "Enough! Are we truly the people of Harmony Grace, or have we become something else entirely? We sit here, tearing each other apart, while the world outside watches and waits for us to fail." The room fell silent, his words landing like stones dropped into still water. Sophia knew she had to speak. Rising from her chair, her legs felt heavy, as if every step toward the center of the room was weighted with the expectations of those around her. She raised a hand and all eyes turned to her. "I hear you," she began, her voice firm yet trembling with emotion. "All of you, and I know what we've lost feels insurmountable, but if we let our anger and pain consume us, then this church will crumble. Not because of Nathaniel, not because of Aaron, but because we refuse to come together." Her words hung in the air, a fragile thread tying the room together. This isn't about defending or condemning Nathaniel. It's about deciding what kind of community we want to be. A fractured one, or one that rebuilds, one painful step at a time. As the meeting adjourned, the congregation filtered out in heavy silence, some lingering in corners to whisper among themselves, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The divisions were clear, the road ahead daunting. But Sophia saw something in their faces, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. Would they find a way to heal, or would the weight of their differences pull them further apart? Could the fractures in their faith ever truly be mended? It was Sunday morning, exactly 2 weeks since the shooting, and the once vibrant congregation of Harmony Grace Church was now a gathering of fractured souls. The sanctuary, though immaculate, seemed to echo the weight of what had transpired. Sophia stood in the pulpit, her hands gripping the edges as if holding on for dear life. The faint murmur of hesitant voices filled the room, fading into silence as her presence commanded attention. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady yet raw with emotion. "I know many of you are hurting. I know trust has been broken and questions linger like shadows over us. But this moment, right here, is where we decide what Harmony Grace stands for. Not as a building, not as a name, but as a family." Sophia paused, scanning the room, her gaze meeting Malcolm's, then Mrs. Porter's, and finally the young woman from the last meeting who had clutched her Bible as if it were her only anchor. Each face carried a story now intertwined with the wounds of this church. Her heart ached under the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their hopes. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not standing here to erase the pain or pretend everything is fine. It's not. And it won't be, not for a while. But what I do know is that division will destroy us faster than any scandal ever could. So I'm asking you, no, I'm pleading with you, to meet me in the middle, not for me, not for Nathaniel, but for each other." Whispers rippled through the room, faint but unmistakable. Sophia had struck a chord, though she wasn't sure if it was harmony or discord. She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, unspoken questions in every pair of eyes fixed on her. She stepped out from behind the pulpit, her voice softening. "Some of you are angry, and you have every right to be. Some of you feel betrayed. Others are clinging to hope, desperate to believe this church can survive. And the truth is, I feel all of that too. I am angry, I am hurt, I am terrified, but I am also committed to each of you and to this place." Her words were met with silence, an unnerving, almost sacred silence. Sophia looked toward the stained glass windows, their vibrant colors dulled by the overcast sky. They were cracked from years of wear, but still they stood, letting the light through. She drew strength from their resilience, using them as a symbol for what the church could become. "We can't erase the past," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but we can learn from it. We can choose to be better together. If we want this church to be a beacon of grace, we must start by offering that grace to one another." Sophia's final words lingered in the air like a prayer unanswered. Slowly, Malcolm nodded, his expression softening. Across the room, Mrs. Porter's rigid stance wavered as she exchanged a hesitant glance with the young woman clutching her Bible. The tension in the room seemed to shift, not resolved, but no longer insurmountable. As the congregation began to disperse, Sophia retreated to her office, closing the door behind her. Alone in the quiet, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on her shoulders, but in her heart, she carried a flicker of hope, a fragile ember that, with care, could grow into a guiding flame. Sophia sat at her desk, staring at the calendar before her. Meetings, counseling sessions, and a long road of rebuilding stretched out before her. Yet she made a silent vow to herself and to the congregation. She would rebuild this church, brick by emotional brick, even if it took everything she had. Could Sophia's quiet determination mend the deep fractures within Harmony Grace Church? Or would the forces pulling them apart prove stronger than the will to heal? What does true leadership look like when the cost feels too great? It began with the relentless glow of camera flashes outside Harmony Grace Church. Reporters huddled in the biting wind, microphones clutched like weapons, eager to dissect the scandal that had rocked this quiet community. The headlines screamed from newsstands and scrolling tickers: faith shattered, Pastor Nathaniel exposed, church shooting sparks national outrage, and the most damning of all, lovers' quarrel ends in bloodshed. By the third week, the media circus was unrelenting. Harmony Grace had become ground zero for speculation, scandal, and sensationalism. Evening broadcasts played on repeat, shaky footage of the sanctuary, interviews with distant congregants, and of course the solemn mugshot of Aaron, juxtaposed with an old smiling photo of Nathaniel. The narrative wasn't just being told, it was being spun, twisted, and stretched for maximum effect. Sophia stood in her office, staring at her computer screen as a pundit dissected every detail of Nathaniel's past. The anchor's voice dripped with faux concern. What does this mean for a faith community built on trust, and can the church recover from such betrayal? The segment ended with a chilling cliffhanger. Coming up, an exclusive look at the pastor's secret life. Sophia slammed the laptop shut, her pulse quickening. That same morning, the church received another blow. A group of reporters had stationed themselves outside the sanctuary, hounding anyone who dared enter. Mrs. Porter, the church's longest-serving member, was caught on camera muttering, "We're supposed to forgive, but how do you forgive something like this?" Inside, Sophia gathered the remaining church leaders for an emergency meeting. The tension in the room was palpable, every whispered comment adding to the mounting pressure. Malcolm leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "We need to control this narrative before it destroys us. If we don't say something soon, they'll define who we are." Sophia's voice was firm, though her hands trembled beneath the table. "And what do we say, Malcolm? That our pastor lied? That someone was shot in the pews where we're supposed to find peace? There's no spin that fixes this." But the breaking point came that evening, during Sophia's quiet moment in the sanctuary. She had just finished cleaning the pews when the heavy oak doors creaked open. A lone reporter stepped inside, notebook in hand. He looked every bit the part, disheveled suit, camera slung over one shoulder, eyes glinting with ambition. His voice was soft but unyielding. "Miss Carter," he began, "do you believe Pastor Nathaniel's affair compromises his ability to lead? Or are you willing to turn a blind eye to sin for the sake of unity?" Sophia's chest tightened. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. What Nathaniel did or didn't do isn't for you or me to decide. This church is about grace, not judgment. But the reporter wasn't satisfied. His next words cut like a blade. "Grace is one thing, covering up a scandal is another. What else are you hiding?" Sophia didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the altar, her back straight, her silence deafening. The reporter lingered for a moment, scribbling furiously, before leaving her in the cold, empty sanctuary. The next morning, the headlines were even worse. "Church in crisis, leadership dodges accountability," one read. Another proclaimed, "Is Harmony Grace hiding more than secrets?" The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch, and Sophia knew the time for silence had passed. Could Sophia find a way to shield her congregation from the storm while holding true to her values? Or would the relentless pursuit of truth leave Harmony Grace in ruins? When the world demands answers, how does a leader balance transparency with protecting the sanctity of the church? The first frost of December coated the steps of Harmony Grace Church, each crystalline shimmer betraying the warmth once synonymous with its name. The sanctuary, now a battlefield of whispered judgments and wavering faith, held its breath for what was to come. At precisely 10:47 a.m., the heavy double doors creaked open, and there he stood, Nathaniel Carter, the man at the heart of their collective reckoning. He moved slowly, his steps deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of the secrets he had so carefully hidden. The air inside felt thick, almost suffocating, as every eye turned toward him. Conversation ceased, the faint rustle of hymnals replaced by a silence that screamed louder than words ever could. His gaze swept the room, meeting faces filled with anger, betrayal, and though few, a flicker of compassion. Nathaniel's hands trembled as he ascended the pulpit, his familiar place of authority now a stage for atonement. He adjusted the microphone, the static amplifying the tension, and began with a voice that carried both weariness and resolve. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he began, his tone steady despite the storm within. "But I must ask for your ears and your hearts, even if they are hardened against me." The congregation remained motionless, an unbroken sea of stoic expressions and folded arms. Nathaniel's gaze dropped to his hands, the same hands that once blessed children, comforted the grieving, and offered hope to the lost. Now they felt foreign, stained by his failures. "For years I stood before you as a man of God, speaking of grace and truth while hiding from my own. I've lied, not just to you, but to myself. My actions, the pain they've caused, you deserved better from me, much better." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a fragile wave of dissent. Malcolm, seated near the front, leaned back with a deep sigh, his disapproval etched into his features. Mrs. Porter dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her expression unreadable. Sophia, from her seat near the back, watched in silence, her own inner conflict a storm she dared not show. Nathaniel pressed on. "I failed to honor my vows to God and to you, my church family, and in doing so, I hurt someone I loved deeply. Aaron didn't come here out of hatred. He came because I broke him. And for that, I carry a guilt I can never fully escape." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, exposing cracks in the walls that once held the congregation together. Nathaniel straightened, meeting the eyes of those who dared to look back at him. "I cannot undo what has been done, but I will not run from it. I will not hide anymore. My only hope now is that this community can find its way to healing, not through me, but through the grace I failed to embody." The room erupted, a cacophony of voices cutting through the silence that had once stifled them. Some called for his resignation, others demanded accountability. And yet a few, just a few, spoke of forgiveness, their voices trembling but firm. As the chaos unfolded, Nathaniel stepped back, his shoulders heavy but his resolve unshaken. He had said his piece, laid bare his soul. Whatever came next was out of his hands. And then a single voice pierced the noise. Sophia stood, her presence commanding despite her own doubts. She didn't speak immediately, allowing the weight of her silence to settle over the room. When she finally did, her words were measured, deliberate. "This isn't just about Nathaniel. It's about us, who we are and who we want to be as a community. Are we a people of judgment, or are we a people of grace?" The congregation fell silent, her question reverberating in the stillness. Nathaniel, standing near the pulpit, turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time, caught between despair and hope. Would Nathaniel's raw confession pave the way for redemption, or had the damage already gone too far? Could Sophia's words bridge a divide that seemed insurmountable? And most importantly, could a congregation so fractured find its way back to unity, or was this the end of Harmony Grace Church as they knew it? The air in Harmony Grace Church felt as though it carried the weight of history, a history steeped in sermons of comfort and hymns of hope, now overshadowed by a singular event that had torn its foundation. At 11:13 a.m., with the congregation restless and divided, Sophia Langley stepped to the pulpit, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. Sophia's heels clicked against the wooden floor, echoing in the silence. The eyes of the congregation, weary and skeptical, followed her ascent to the pulpit. For years she had been a quiet figure in the church, known for her tireless support of its programs and her ability to listen. Today she was neither quiet nor invisible. She was the bridge this fractured community so desperately needed. She placed her hands on the edges of the pulpit, her fingers brushing against the faint grooves carved by decades of sermons. Her voice, steady and unyielding, filled the room. "I didn't want to stand here today," she began, her tone honest and unembellished. "I didn't ask for this. None of us asked for any of this. But here we are, broken and bruised, with a choice before us." The congregation sat motionless, their gazes fixed on her, some skeptical, others curious. A few faces bore thinly veiled contempt, but she pressed on. "We are not gathered here as a perfect people. We are a congregation of sinners and saints, of those who doubt and those who believe. And today we have a decision to make, not about Nathaniel, not about Aaron, but about who we are as a community. Her words hung in the air, their weight palpable. Malcolm shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Porter clutched her Bible tighter. The younger members of the congregation exchanged furtive glances, unsure of where the speech was heading. For weeks now, we've let our pain and anger define us. We've pointed fingers, whispered in hallways, and judged harshly. But is that who we are? Is that the legacy we want to leave for our children? Sophia paused, her gaze sweeping the room, catching each person in its wake. Her voice softened, but the conviction in her words remained unshaken. Nathaniel made mistakes. So did Aaron. So have I. So have you. And while their actions have caused harm, while their choices have hurt us, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to truly heal? Does it mean casting stones? Or does it mean extending the grace we so often preach? In the back row, a young woman wiped away a tear. A man near the front folded his arms, his jaw tight. The room was a living portrait of division, yet something in Sophia's words seemed to touch the edges of that divide. This church has stood for decades, not because it was perfect, but because it was resilient. Because when the world pressed us down, we stood together. Today, I ask you to stand with me, not for Nathaniel, not for Aaron, but for the soul of this church. Her voice cracked slightly, a testament to the emotions she worked hard to control. The rawness of her plea resonated more than any polished sermon ever could. Forgiveness isn't easy. It doesn't mean we forget or excuse, but it does mean we choose to move forward, together. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a single voice rang out. Mrs. Porter stood, her hands trembling, but her voice clear. She's right. We have to move forward. Another voice joined in, then another. Slowly, a ripple of agreement spread through the congregation. It wasn't unanimous and it wasn't without resistance, but it was a start. Sophia stepped back from the pulpit, her chest rising and falling with relief. She had said what needed to be said. The next steps would not be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt hope, a fragile but undeniable flicker of hope. As the congregation rose to their feet, their voices joining in an impromptu hymn, the tension in the room began to lift. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. This was her church. These were her people. And they were choosing unity over division, grace over judgment. Would the fragile peace hold, or would the deep scars prove too difficult to heal? Could Nathaniel truly find redemption in a community still grappling with his betrayal? And what role would Sophia play as the church forged its uncertain path forward? It was the morning of March 22nd, a day etched with both trepidation and hope in the hearts of Harmony Grace Church's congregation. The sun pierced through the remaining stained glass windows, casting fragmented light across the sanctuary, a reminder of a once unbroken unity now shadowed by doubt. By 9 a.m., every pew was filled, yet the room was engulfed in an uneasy silence. Men and women clutched their Bibles, some tightly enough to leave their knuckles white. Others sat with arms crossed, gazes locked on the pulpit, where a decision awaited that would define the church's future. At 9:15 a.m., Malcolm Richards stood. His voice, as measured as it was heavy, called the meeting to order. Brothers and sisters, he began, his tone carrying the weight of decades spent in this sanctuary. We are here today not to erase what has happened, but to confront it head-on. This is our church, and its direction. Our direction rests in our hands. As he spoke, whispers broke out across the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The floor was open for discussion. First to speak was Mrs. Porter, her voice firm but tinged with sorrow. I've been here for 40 years. I've seen pastors come and go, but none like Nathaniel. He made mistakes, yes, but hasn't he also led us with love and integrity before this? Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, but as she sat, a younger man rose. His name was Jonathan Ellis, a newcomer to the congregation, his eyes blazing with conviction. With respect, Mrs. Porter, he began, his voice shaking but resolute. How can we overlook this? How can we trust a man who kept secrets that have brought shame to this church? Redemption is one thing, but leadership demands accountability. The room erupted. Voices clashed, some defending Nathaniel, others condemning him. Malcolm's gavel struck the pulpit once, twice, and finally a third time before silence was restored. Order, Malcolm commanded. This is not a trial, but a decision. Speak your truth, but let's remember who we are. More voices followed. Sophia sat silently, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She listened as congregants debated Nathaniel's failings and virtues, each argument a mirror reflecting the division in their hearts. Finally, Sophia stood. The room hushed. This isn't just about Nathaniel, she began. It's about us. About whether we believe in the principles we claim to uphold. Grace, accountability, and healing. Whatever decision we make today, let it not be out of anger or fear, but out of hope for what this church can become. Her words hung in the air, met with a mix of nods and uncertain glances. The weight of the decision bore down on everyone present as Malcolm called for the vote. Ballots were distributed and pens scratched paper in unison. Time seemed to slow as the ushers collected the slips, placing them in a wooden box once used for tithes. Each creak of the floor echoed like thunder, each face a portrait of apprehension. At 11:03 a.m., the final ballot was cast. Malcolm stepped forward, flanked by two elders to count the votes. The sanctuary was a symphony of restless movements, fidgeting hands, shuffling feet, and whispered prayers. Sophia closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as she sought strength for whatever was to come. After what felt like an eternity, Malcolm returned to the pulpit, the wooden box held tightly in his hands. His face betrayed nothing as he set it down and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "The votes," he began, his voice steady but solemn, "have been counted. By a narrow margin, it has been decided that Pastor Nathaniel will." The pause stretched long enough to steal the breath from the room. Every heart thudded in anticipation, every eye fixed on Malcolm's lips as they formed the next words. "Continue as pastor of Harmony Grace Church, on the condition that he steps away temporarily to seek spiritual counsel and accountability." The room exploded, not in applause, but in an eruption of voices both relieved and outraged. Some wept openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. The decision was made, yet the division remained. Sophia rose, her presence commanding the room's attention. "This is not the end. This is the beginning of our healing. Whether you agree or disagree with this decision, I ask that you stand with me in rebuilding this church one step at a time." Her words did not silence every dissent, but they planted a seed, a possibility of unity amid chaos. Would Nathaniel's journey toward redemption satisfy those who doubted his sincerity? Could the congregation truly move forward, or would fractures deepen into irreparable divides? And most importantly, would Harmony Grace rise from the shadows of its scandal to become the beacon of faith it once was? April 10th. The air outside Harmony Grace Church carried a quiet buzz, a mix of anticipation and renewal that seemed to ripple through the community. Inside the sanctuary, the scent of fresh paint mingled with the faint aroma of lilies lining the altar. For the first time in months, the church felt alive. It had been 2 weeks since the vote, 2 weeks of hard work and fragile hope. Volunteers moved with purpose, their hands scrubbing pews, hanging new drapes, and repairing the last of the storm-damaged windows. But it wasn't just the building being rebuilt. It was the spirit of a congregation learning to trust itself again. By 9:30 a.m., the main hall was unrecognizable. Where tension and division once festered, the space now pulsed with warmth and connection. Sophia had overseen the transformation, ensuring every detail reflected the church's mission of healing and service. The stained glass windows, once fractured, now depicted scenes of grace and forgiveness, their vivid colors dancing across the walls in soft hues as sunlight streamed through. In the corner of the room, a group of teenagers huddled around a table covered with brightly colored flyers. The new youth mentorship program, set to launch the following week, promised support for at-risk teens in the community, a vision that had grown from the pain of recent events. Near the entrance, Malcolm greeted newcomers with a warm handshake, his voice steady as he explained the church's upcoming initiatives. "We're introducing counseling services, grief support groups, and weekly community meals," he shared with one family. "This isn't just a church, it's a place for everyone." Amid the bustling activity, an older woman named Mrs. Porter sat quietly in the front pew, her hands clasped around a tattered Bible. She had been the first to return after the shooting, her unwavering faith a silent call for others to follow. Her eyes drifted to the altar, where a small plaque had been placed in honor of those who had endured and persevered. Its inscription read, "Through grace, we rebuild." At 10 a.m., Sophia emerged from her office, her steps deliberate as she moved toward the pulpit. Dressed in a simple navy dress, she exuded a calm authority that silenced the room without a single word. Standing at the podium, she scanned the faces before her. Some were familiar, others new. All of them carried stories of loss, resilience, and the fragile beginnings of forgiveness. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but warm. "Today is more than a new chapter for Harmony Grace. It is a testament to what we can achieve when we choose healing over division, hope over despair." She gestured toward the newly restored windows. These windows once bore the scars of violence. Now they tell a story of redemption. And just like these windows, we are not perfect. We are still piecing ourselves back together. But every small step, every act of kindness, brings us closer to becoming whole. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of papers as people wiped their eyes. Her words carried a weight that resonated deeply, yet they also carried a lightness, a glimmer of what could be. Sophia continued, "This church belongs to all of us. Its future depends on each of you. Whether it's volunteering, mentoring, or simply showing up for one another, your presence matters." As she spoke, the congregation seemed to breathe as one, their collective heartbeat a quiet echo of shared resolve. The fractures in their community were still visible, but for the first time in months, they no longer felt insurmountable. When Sophia stepped back, the sanctuary erupted in quiet applause, not loud or boisterous, but heartfelt. Mrs. Porter stood first, followed by Malcolm, and then the rest of the room. Together they rose, their unity a silent promise. The service ended with an invitation, a community meal held in the church basement, open to all. The aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering stew wafted through the halls as families gathered around long tables. At one table, a teenager laughed with an elderly volunteer. At another, Malcolm discussed plans for the church's next project with a group of young parents. Everywhere there was movement, connection, and a quiet hum of hope. As the day turned to evening, the sanctuary emptied, leaving only Sophia and the fading light of the stained glass windows. She stood by the altar, her hand resting on the plaque's inscription. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. But questions lingered in her mind. Would this fragile unity hold as new challenges arose? Could Nathaniel's eventual return heal the wounds that still festered beneath the surface? And most pressing of all, what would it take to ensure that Harmony Grace's transformation was more than a fleeting moment of peace? As the final rays of sunlight painted the sanctuary in warm hues, one question echoed louder than the rest. Could Grace truly rebuild what had been broken, or was the journey just beginning? April 15th. A soft drizzle coated the streets of Harmony Grace as Nathaniel walked the familiar path toward the community center. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming dogwoods. For the first time in years, he walked without the weight of his collar. Just a man seeking to reconcile with a world he had once led astray. The community had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. He noticed it in the repaired fences, the freshly planted flowers along the church garden, and the laughter of children playing in the park. These were small victories, Nathaniel thought, each one a symbol of resilience, a whisper of hope in the aftermath of so much pain. Nathaniel's steps slowed as he approached the community center, the vibrant mural on its exterior catching his eye. It depicted a rising sun, its rays illuminating a diverse group of hands joined together. Below it, a simple phrase read, "Unity through grace." He reached for the door handle, pausing for a moment. The last time he had entered this building was as the church's leader, confident and composed. Now he was simply Nathaniel, flawed, humbled, and searching for a way to make amends. Inside, the sounds of youth filled the air. A group of teenagers huddled around a whiteboard, brainstorming ideas for a mentorship program. Across the room, Aaron stood, his voice animated as he guided a group of young boys through a discussion about accountability and choices. Their laughter, their energy, it was contagious. Nathaniel lingered at the edge of the room, observing quietly. He could see the spark of purpose in Aaron's eyes, a stark contrast to the broken man he had once faced in the sanctuary. Aaron caught his gaze and nodded. a small but significant gesture that carried more forgiveness than words ever could. Later that evening, Nathaniel sat at a small desk in his apartment, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the page before him. A stack of envelopes lay beside him, each addressed to someone he had hurt, congregants, friends, even estranged family. His pen moved slowly, the weight of his words pressing against him. He wrote of his failures, his regrets, and his commitment to change. These weren't just apologies, they were promises. To himself, to those he had wronged, and to the God he still clung to despite his doubts. One letter in particular gave him pause. The address was simple: Harmony Grace Church. For a long moment, Nathaniel stared at the name etched in black ink, Sophia Chen. Her unwavering determination and quiet strength had been the glue that held the congregation together when he could not. He hesitated before placing the letter in the envelope, sealing it with a quiet prayer. It was a small gesture, but it was all he had to give. Days turned into weeks, and Nathaniel found himself drawn to the small, everyday acts of rebuilding. He volunteered at the community garden, his hands caked with dirt as he worked alongside others to plant seeds of renewal. He spoke to the youth at the center, sharing his story not as a sermon, but as a cautionary tale. Each act, though small, felt like a step forward, a brick in the foundation of his redemption. And yet, he knew that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that would require him to confront the darkest corners of his soul. May 1st. The sun hung low in the sky as Nathaniel found himself standing outside the church. The familiar scent of lavender wafted from the garden, mingling with the faint strains of a hymn drifting through the open windows. The door stood before him, an unspoken invitation. He traced the edges of the weathered wood, yet his mind swirling with memories, the triumphs, the failures, the moments that had defined him. This place had been his sanctuary and his crucible. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his hand resting on the door handle. He wasn't sure if he was ready to step inside, to face the congregation, to face Sophia. But then, could redemption ever truly wait for readiness? Or was it forged in the moments when we chose to walk forward despite our fear? And so, with the faint hum of the hymn in his ears and the weight of his journey in his heart, Nathaniel pushed the door open. But what awaited him inside? Forgiveness? Judgment? Or something he had yet to imagine? As the sanctuary's light spilled over him, one question lingered in the air. Can a man truly rebuild the bridges he has burned, or must he learn to walk a different path entirely? May 12th. A bright morning sun stretched over the rooftops of Harmony Grace, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. For Aaron, this was the first time in years that the warmth of a new day didn't feel like a cruel contrast to the storm inside him. He walked with purpose toward the community center, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his jacket. The sound of children's laughter spilled into the street, mingling with the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional chirp of a sparrow. The world was alive, and for once, Aaron didn't feel out of place in it. Inside the center, the energy was infectious. A group of boys circled around him, their eyes wide with curiosity as he described the choices that had once led him astray. He spoke plainly, sparing no detail, but his voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet resolve to turn his missteps into something meaningful. A boy raised his hand, his voice timid but curious. "Mr. Aaron, does it ever get easier? Fixing things, I mean?" Aaron knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "No," he said gently. "It doesn't get easier, but every day you get stronger. And one day you'll look back and see how far you've come. That's when you'll know it was worth it." As the session ended, Aaron lingered by the door, watching the children run out to meet their parents. One of the mothers approached him, her expression tentative. She extended her hand and he recognized her immediately. Mrs. Porter, a steadfast presence at Harmony Grace. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you're doing here. It means more than you know." Aaron accepted her handshake, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to say so much, to apologize for the pain he had caused, to explain that this was his way of making amends, but all he could manage was a quiet, heartfelt thank you. That evening, Aaron returned home to find an envelope waiting on his doorstep. His name was written in a familiar hand, Nathaniel's. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the memories of their last encounter washing over him like a tide. He sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, the letter resting in front of him. The edges were crisp, the seal unbroken. He ran his fingers over the paper, his mind racing with questions. What could Nathaniel possibly say to him now? Was it an apology, a plea for forgiveness, or something else entirely? Aaron didn't open the letter that night. Instead, he placed it in the drawer beside his bed, deciding to let the weight of the day settle before facing whatever words Nathaniel had chosen to share. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder, could the wounds between them ever truly heal? And if they could, would the scars they left behind serve as a reminder of pain, or as proof of survival? In the quiet moments before sleep, Aaron realized something profound. Redemption wasn't a gift to be granted. It was a responsibility to be carried. And though the journey was far from over, he was willing to walk it, step by step, day by day. But as his eyes closed, the letter in the drawer seemed to call to him, whispering questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. What does forgiveness look like when it's written in another man's hand? And can two broken souls find a way to rebuild not apart but together? June 2nd. The morning sun streamed through the newly restored stained glass windows of Harmony Grace Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colours over the congregation. The sanctuary was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. It was the culmination of weeks of pain, resilience, and quiet rebuilding. And at the heart of it all stood Sophia. She gripped the edges of the pulpit, her eyes scanning the crowd. The faces before her carried a mixture of anticipation and hope, a stark contrast to the anguish and division that had once threatened to tear them apart. The air was thick with the kind of silence that begged to be filled with purpose. "This church has stood through storms," Sophia began, her voice steady but rich with emotion. Storms that threatened to shake its very foundation. Yet here we are, not because the building endured, but because we did. Together. Her words carried through the sanctuary, resonating deeply with those who had lived through the chaos. She spoke of grace, not the kind earned through perfection, but the kind born in the ashes of failure. She reminded them that unity was not the absence of conflict, but the triumph of love over division. Sophia's sermon wove a tapestry of forgiveness and accountability, drawing from the past without being shackled to it. She honored the scars left behind, framing them as reminders of the strength it took to heal. "Every crack in this building," she said, gesturing toward the walls, "is a testament to the light we let in." She addressed the controversies head-on, offering Nathaniel's return and Aaron's transformation as proof that redemption was not a destination but a journey. She urged the congregation to extend the same grace they had received, to each other, to the world, and to themselves. When Sophia's voice faltered slightly, the congregation held their breath. But it wasn't weakness that caused her pause. It was the weight of a moment she knew would linger in their hearts. "I'm not here to promise an easy road ahead," she said, her tone softening. "But I can promise this. Harmony Grace will remain a place of refuge, of honesty, and of hope. Together, we will be more than we ever thought possible." As she stepped back, the sanctuary erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, tears streaming down some faces, others clapping with a fervor that shook the walls. It wasn't just applause, it was a release, a declaration of faith in something bigger than themselves. Sophia descended the steps of the pulpit, her heart pounding. She didn't see herself as a savior, only as a servant to the community she had vowed to protect. She moved through the crowd, exchanging handshakes and embraces, her presence a quiet reassurance that they were indeed on solid ground. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia stood outside the church. The building glowed softly, its lights spilling onto the street like a beacon. Children's laughter echoed from the yard, where families gathered for a potluck, and for the first time in months, the air felt free of tension. Sophia glanced at the stained glass windows, the images of redemption and unity etched into their vibrant hues. She thought of all that had been lost and all that had been gained. Her journey had been far from perfect, but it had been real, and in that imperfection, she had found her strength. As Sophia turned to join the gathering, her steps purposeful, a quiet resolve settled over her. The work was far from finished, but it didn't need to be. Harmony Grace wasn't just a church, It was a testament to the power of starting over, of choosing love, even when it was hard. And as the night unfolded, one question lingered in the air. What does it mean to truly lead? Not from a place of authority, but from a place of service, vulnerability, and unshakable hope.